Greetings, Doom fans, and welcome to another edition of the Frostbite Falls Daily Rant, here on the Doomstead Diner. The crash in the global markets, which took off with the new year, shows no signs of abating. If anything, it's accelerating now. Oil prices broke through the $30 barrier, and as I write this rant, have sunk to a $28 handle, and that's just the official price. Discounts are being offered up all over the place to try and get rid of the inventory. But unfortunately, despite the new low prices every day, consumers are not stepping up to the plate to burn the stuff in the copious quantities they have in the past. Demand is at best stagnant and actually in decline in many places despite the low prices. The Chinese economy is in a full-on implosion mode, so they're not picking up the slack on the demand end, while at the same time sanctions have been lifted off Iran, so they're ready to start dumping more oil onto a saturated market. I am reminded of the scene in Dances with Wolves, where Kevin Costner and his flatulent Teamster wagon driver, who is bringing him out to the remote fort on the prairie, run across a skeleton full of arrows. The Teamster comes over and laughs and says, "Somebody back east must be saying, 'Now, why don't he write?'" In this case, you have dim-witted economistas and energy shills wondering, "Now, why don't they buy? Cheap prices. Why isn't everybody taking off on road trips for the Great White North?" They apparently missed the memo that when you are completely broke with no job, it doesn't matter how cheap the price gets, you still can't afford it. At the current prices now in the $28 range, just about none of the tight oil or tar sands from the Great White North is profitable. All the extractors are bleeding red ink like pigmen in a slaughterhouse. But so far to date, quite magically, just a very few small players have declared bankruptcy, leading one to wonder how the bigger boys manage to keep floating here. This is fairly simple. They fit in the category of too big to fail, and none of the too big to fail banks who hold their debt are marking to market. They are just marking to make believe. Just like the subprime fiasco of the last financial crashes in 2008, just this time on a bigger scale with about $2 trillion in impaired assets out there. Impaired is newspeak for fucking worthless dog shit. Besides the $2 trillion directly in increasingly non-performing loans are all the derivatives written on this debt, which nobody knows just how much it actually is, but is quite certainly at least an order of magnitude greater than the debt itself, and probably more than that. Nobody has money to pay off this shit, so nobody wants to declare a credit event on anything but the smallest companies. Because once the cascade gets rolling, the whole house of cards comes down in the greatest bonfire of paper wealth in all of recorded history. Despite the fact nobody wants to admit to it on the credit level, the panic is already quite evident in equities, with global stock markets absolutely tanking over the last 2 weeks. The Nikkei is already in bear market territory, 20% down. Some bourses in MENA have hit 40% and even 50% in the case of Saudis. And the Hang Seng Index is on a downhill race to the bottom that would even scare Peekaboo Street. The famed PPT, or Plunge Protection Team from the Fed, appears completely impotent to stop this slide here in the fascist states of America. The smartest guys in the room appear to have limp dicks at the moment. Somebody better send out for some Viagra pretty damn quick. Across the Pacific Pond, the Chinese PPT isn't doing any better, draining the massive $3 trillion in forex reserves they accumulated in the piggy bank down to $2 trillion here already in the effort to prop up the market and their sinking currency, which may have slowed things down some, but they look to be getting nervous as the bank account dwindles. It took 30 years of slave labor to work up that savings account, and at the rate they're going, they'll burn through the whole pile in a couple of years at the outside. Same deal for the Saudi princes, who also worked up a nice savings account over the years of high oil prices, but who now have accumulated such large bills to manage a blown-up population that they are also burning through their reserves as their own currencies circles the toilet, along with the currencies of every other OPEC country, Canada, and Mother Russia, too. The only real question at the moment is whose government will collapse first and where the first big riots will be. Saudi seems like a good bet on this, as the Saudis pursue a foreign policy that is pissing off just about everyone outside their borders, and the population inside their borders is none too happy about skyrocketing food prices either. How long they can keep the oil flowing out of Gawar at any price remains an open question here. All across the board, you see dollar liquidity drying up as investors run for the fire exit, but find it increasingly more difficult to find a greater fool who will buy the dog shit on their books. Investor is another newspeak euphemism. It conjures up pictures of individuals with a few stock in the retirement portfolio. But investors are really the too-big-to-fail banks themselves. Not only are their loan books going south, but stocks they use as collateral are also losing value on a daily basis now. Something like $5 trillion in notional wealth has already been lost here, which means these banks aren't as well capitalized as they were just a few weeks ago, and the reserves they hold against losses are increasingly questionable and increasingly illiquid. While there aren't too many individual investors out there anymore, there are, of course, some very large pension funds, both public and private, that have their retirees' money sprinkled all over the stock and bond markets that are going south. These funds often project out a 5% or so rate of return in order to be solvent on paper, which few of them have actually been getting in the days of zero interest rate policy. And those that did show those kind of returns did it by investing in junk energy bonds, which are now going worthless. Unlike the too-big-to-fail banks, the Fed does not generally bail out pension funds of Joe Sixpack. So one waits for the first big one of these to go tits up, like CalPERS or the United Federation of Teachers. The fascist states of America military pensions aren't doing so well either, and the history of the bonus army indicates that the government will let military vets twist in the wind also while bailing out the fat cats. Which all means, of course, somebody here that is too big to fail is going to need a bailout, bail-in, or bail-orama here in the not-too-distant future. Exactly how the Fed will pull this off when their own balance sheet is filled with more dog shit than anyone else out there is another one of those great mysteries of the universe. In tandem with the financial system tanking, the flip side of the equation is that more military confrontations and saber-rattling goes on every day, and it's becoming impossible to determine who is allied with who and where anymore. Although ISIS appears to be universally aided by everyone except maybe the Saudis. Japan, while it is conflicting with China over the Spratly Islands and the South China Sea, is now jawboning closer ties with Mother Russia. Except, weren't China and Russia supposed to be allied here? Isn't Japan supposed to be allied with the FSA? And isn't Vlad the Impaler supposed to be Satan? Everybody is pivoting in a different direction every news day, making it quite clear that we're on a rudderless ship in a minefield. The big question in the mind of the collapsnik, though, is this the big one? Is this the fast collapse scenario getting underway at last? I'd have to go back to the Great Depression to make a wild-ass guess on that one. The stock crash occurred in 1929, but it wasn't until 1932 to 1934 that the Great Depression really got into full swing with the default of Kreditanstalt, a Rothschild bank, in 1931. It takes a while for the losses that accrue from market crashes to finally get recognized as a great amount of book cooking and financial fraud follows in the aftermath of the crash. It could go faster or slower in this case due to the advent of computers. On the one hand, it could happen quicker since all the transactions are now at the speed of light. Or it could go slower because computers vastly scale up the amount of financial fraud possible. Figuring these two effects cancel each other out, a 2 to 3 year period before the market crash makes its way out to the real economy and trashes it even worse than it's already trashed seems like a reasonable wild-ass guess. There are, of course, numerous black swans that could come in for a landing in the intervening period. The Saudis and Iranians could get into a shooting war with each other, rather than battling it out through proxies, as one possibility. The big one, earthquake, hitting the Pacific Northwest and sliding Seattle into the ocean, is another possibility. The one thing you can be sure of, however, is that the mayhem is going to keep increasing through the time period, and there will be no shortage of collapse stories to chronicle along the way to the bottom. And that's all the doom. This time until next time, here on the Doomstead Diner. Later, Doomers.